Asia has become the most important geopolitical region in the world. It is estimated that by 2035, China will have overtaken the United States to become the world's biggest economy and maybe also its most powerful political actor, if it isn't already. Now, what does the next 30 years look like? We are seeing a shift in terms of economic gravity from the west to the east. This is most obviously seen in the rise of China. However, we are seeing a rise in emerging markets, free markets, established democracies, and authoritarian rules. When analysing share of GDP by continents, it is clear to see that Asia is expected to continue to grow rapidly in the next 30 years, while America and Europe expect to shrink. By no surprise, China is expected to rise to the leaderboard, replacing the United States as the number one in GDP ranking. However, other emerging markets such as India and Indonesia expect to rapidly rise up and become prominent states in global economics. This too comes as no surprise. In 2000, emerging markets accounted for about a fifth of global output. However, by 2042, emerging markets will overtake advanced economies as the largest contributors to global GDP, and by 2050, they will contribute 60% of global GDP. With a core group of emerging states situated in Asia, it is clear that it is expected to become the cornerstone of global economics. Once essential states in global politics, many European states are expected to rapidly shrink in the next 30 years. By 2030, India is expected to overtake the declining Japan to become the third largest economy. By 2035, China is expected to be number one.
Joe Biden has won the American presidential election.
As a result of the US election became clear, governments around the world were asking themselves what this means for them. Nowhere, perhaps, was this more abundantly clear than in Asia, with the region of Indo-Pacific, which the Biden team regard as the place of the future, and also a key strategic location to counter the great power rivalry between China and the United States. The president has assembled a foreign policy and national advisory group of more than 2,000 people, many of which served during Obama's reign and played a key role in Obama's pivot to Asia.
I have directed my national security team to make our presence and mission in the Asia Pacific a top priority. As a result, reductions in U.S. defense spending will not, I repeat, will not come at the expense of the Asia Pacific.
Obama's pivot to Asia's core intention was to move America's focus away from the Middle East to Asia and specifically to counter China. This move focused upon security alliances, engaging with emerging powers, trade and investment, military presence, and advancing democracy. Former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Kurt Campbell, who now is a key advisor to Biden, suggested that the pivot was intended to remind Beijing of US staying power at a time when Chinese policymakers were dangerously anticipating a US withdrawal from Asia and ready to discount American influence in the region. The pivot was an attempt to actively reinforce American hegemony. Key components of the pivot were the various multilateral agreements such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump withdrew from the treaty, claiming that it would push more manufacturing jobs overseas. Obama's pivot to Asia has been widely criticized for making Asia-Pacific relations worse, while allowing the Middle East and Europe to fall deeper into chaos due to neglect. Now, after Trump's term, the Biden administration has to contend with a China that has grown less restrained in pursuit of its ambitions. The United States and China's relationship has grown severely fragile as confrontation has intensified. With any transition of power comes great risk. Although China lags behind militarily, its economic status is one of a superpower. China's rise from a poor developing country to a major economic superpower has been astonishing. In the period of 4 decades, China's GDP has grown at an average rate of nearly 10%, and according to the World Bank, China has experienced the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history. It has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. The US biggest trade partner is China. Total trade between the two states grew from $5 billion in the 1980s to $660 billion in 2018. US companies are taking advantage of the booming Chinese market and the lower labor costs in manufacturing. However, China is a huge concern for many policymakers.
China. I love them. China.
China's economic aspirations are no more evident than its Belt Road Initiative. This grand strategy plans to finance infrastructure throughout Asia, Africa, and Europe. If successful, this will significantly expand export and investment markets, furthermore increasing its soft power globally. US-China relations worsened during Trump's term as the two countries engaged in a damaging trade war, competing on technology and clashed over issues including human rights and the origins of the current health crisis. Early signs of Biden's term suggest that this policy stance won't differ greatly to Trump. China policy in 2021, I think, is actually going to be about ally policy, said Scott Kennedy, a senior advisor at think tank Center of Strategic and International Studies. The US will spend much of their time not directly engaging China, but engaging allies in Asia and Europe on China. That would stand in contrast with Trump's preferred approach to confront Beijing largely unilaterally, which yielded little results. In his first foreign policy speech, US President Joe Biden described China as the most serious competitor to America and vowed to confront Beijing on various fronts, including human rights, intellectual property, and economic policy.
Our most serious competitor, China, will confront China's economic abuses, counter its aggressive, coercive action to push back on China's attack on human rights, intellectual property, and global governance.
It is clear that the Biden administration will take a tougher approach to China, similar to that of Trump. However, a more collective multilateral approach will be seen, coinciding with more traditional democratic presidents. However, does Biden face an uphill task in collectively developing an anti-China alliance in Asia? US President Joe Biden may find it difficult to gather Asian swing states into a coalition against China. James Crabtree, a professor of public policy in Singapore, said,
"What the US has done traditionally is it's tried to use both its security and economic power to entice allies into its camp. So, for instance, it set up the original TPP trade agreement. Then Trump didn't go into the TPP, and Biden has promised a trade and economic policy which is only going to benefit the American middle class. And the problem that he faces is if he actually does that, it's much more difficult then to try and strike economic agreements with countries here in Asia, the big Asian exporting countries that are the swing states against China. It's much more difficult for the US to entice them into a broader anti-China alliance."
The reality is that American economic weight is declining. China's is increasing. And China is also doing a pretty good job of stealing America's clothes as a protector of free trade in the region. It is clear that the United States under Biden faces an uphill challenge in countering the rise of China. Asia is the most important geopolitical region in the world today. The rise of emerging markets, rising democracies, and authoritarian states, and the mighty rise of China make it a region in which the United States will find difficulty in dealing with.